Boop boop ba boom ba dum bum. Boop boop ba boom ba dum ba da da dum da dum. Doo doo da dum ba dum bum. Beep ba boop ba boop ba boop da ba dum bum. Beep ba boop ba beep beep boop ba ba dum bum. Well, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to reasonandbalance.com. We're here today, and what I hope to do is hope to give you some background on free trade theory. Obviously, this has been a hotly contested issue, especially in light of the 2016 presidential campaign. Both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders have hit this issue pretty heavily. Of course, the Trans-Pacific Partnership has been a big issue as well. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about where it all started in terms of free trade theory. And maybe it'll give you some insight as to what's the best thing to do for the country to do. It's a hot button issue because it involves people's livelihoods. People have lost jobs, but free trade also has its benefits. If you go to Walmart or you buy a lot of goods there or whatever, a lot of the low prices are because of free trade. So where do we come out on all this? Well, I'm not going to answer that question today, but I will provide you with some of the theoretical underpinnings that go along with free trade theory. Then, right around the time of the American Revolution, this guy came along. His name was Adam Smith, and he wrote this very famous book, and anybody that goes to business school or takes an economics course in college has heard of it. It's called The Wealth of Nations. Adam Smith is often thought of as the father of American free enterprise and capitalism. Anyway, Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations set forth this theory, and he came up with an example to prove his theory of why free trade and not the mercantilism system that was being utilized was a better way to go about things because it would benefit more people widely. And he based his theory on something called absolute advantage. His point was made in a manner that's fairly similar to what we're going to show you here in 1 second, but he used the concept of absolute advantage. And then about 30 or 40 years later, I think it was a political economist by the name of David Ricardo came along, and he said Adam Smith's right, absolutely right, but he actually doesn't go far enough. He says that free trade is even more advantageous than what Adam Smith suggests. So what we're going to see here today is the genesis of free trade theory. It's David Ricardo's example, and I've changed it a little bit. I've made all the trade in US dollars. Obviously, he wouldn't have done that, but basically this audience probably can associate with that a little better. And I've changed a few of the numbers, but this is it in a nutshell. All right, so let's take two countries. I just picked two at random. There's no significance to the countries that I picked, and neither one of them probably make. Well, I don't know. Japan probably produces some rice. I don't know, but I just said cocoa and rice. Okay, and it's Belize and Japan are the two countries. Okay, now let's figure out. First of all, we've got to figure that. First of all, let me say basically. Both countries are. I'm going to give both countries a budget of $800. All right, to make. You can say 800 million. I don't care, but $800 to make and produce both of these items. So that's the amount, the max bucks they can spend, both of them, to make both products. Okay, the cost structure in Belize is, lo and behold, it costs them $20 a ton to do a ton of cocoa, to produce domestically a ton of cocoa. It costs them $26.67 to produce a ton domestically within Belize of rice. Japan, on the other hand, it costs them a whopping $80 a ton to produce in Japan cocoa, and it costs them $40 a ton to produce a ton in Japan of rice. Okay, so both countries produce everything internally in their home countries, and they consume everything at home. They don't engage in any trade. Let's say that both countries do that, they produce and consume everything at home, and both decide to use half of their budget, half of the $800, namely $400 to produce each item. So that means that for $400, Belize, using this cost structure, can produce 20 tons. 20 times $20 is 20 tons times $20 a ton is $400. Since it costs them more, $26.67, they can produce 15 tons of rice. Japan, on the other hand, again producing exclusively in Japan and consuming everything in Japan, takes half of its $800, the $400. They can produce 5 tons of cocoa, because 5 times 80 is 400, and they can produce 10 tons of rice. 40 times 10 is $400. You'll notice that if you put all this together, if you added both countries' production up and consumption up, it's 25 tons plus 25 tons, which is 50 tons. Okay, this is where David Ricardo comes in. You'll notice here that Belize has an absolute advantage, that's in Adam Smith's terms, of $20 to $80. They can produce cocoa. Belize can produce cocoa 4 times as efficiently as Japan. Okay, with the rice. They can produce rice, however, $26.67 versus 40. So Belize has an absolute advantage in producing both products. I mean, Japan can't compete with Belize at all in terms of cost structure to produce either item. So, but this is where all right, so Belize has an absolute advantage in both products. So, but this is where David Ricardo goes beyond Adam Smith. Because in this situation, he's going to show that both countries, even though Japan is less efficient at both items, both countries are going to benefit from engaging in trade if they exploit Belize's comparative advantage as what it can produce cocoa at versus the cost that it can produce rice at. Since Belize is 4 times as efficient on cocoa as Japan, but only 1.5 times more efficient in producing rice, this is where its comparative advantage. Its comparative advantage is in cocoa relative to rice. Okay? So, they decide to play around with the numbers. I'm not going to go through all that, but they're going to play around with all the numbers, and they come up with this scenario for trade so that both Belize and Japan will be better off. Belize decides to use 3/4 of its resources, which is 3/4 of $800 is $600 to produce cocoa, and 1/4 of its resources to produce rice. Why? Because it has a comparative advantage in cocoa. And relatively speaking, Japan is at less of a disadvantage in producing rice. So we're going to let Japan use all of its resources to produce rice. Okay, so that means if Belize is going to use 3/4 of 800, which is 600, the other quarter must go to rice. So Belize ends up doing 30 tons of cocoa and 75 tons of rice. You can see that's 3/4 of 800, that's 1/4 of 800. And Japan isn't going to do any cocoa, and they're only going to produce rice. So that's $800 worth of using this cost structure up here, both parties. They do 20 tons of rice. They can produce 20 tons of rice for $800. Now you notice immediately, if you add up this production, all of a sudden the two countries are actually, for the same amount of collective money, they're producing 57.5 tons versus 50 tons. So they're producing more. And so, but here's where the benefit comes in. Really, they both produced more, but they've also agreed to trade. And so they decided to do 1 for 1. They decided to do 8 tons of cocoa for 8 tons of rice. Belize exports cocoa to Japan, and Japan exports 8 tons of rice to Belize. Okay, Belize is going to export what it has the comparative advantage in, the item that it has the comparative advantage in, and Japan's going to export the item that it has less of a comparative disadvantage in. So this is what happens, 8 tons. So 30 minus 8 is 22, 7.5, and they're getting rice, so 7.5 plus 8 is 15.5. Of course, 0, and Japan is now getting 8, so that's where that 8 comes from. And it's going to get 20, and Japan is going to export 8 tons of rice. 20 minus 8 is 12. So this is what they end up with right here. Now, if Adam Smith showed at this point, he said, voila. He said, both countries, even though Japan is less effective, less efficient than Belize is at both products, it still makes sense for them to trade and let Japan do something that's less inefficient at. And here's the proof. If you take, this is the increase in wealth, consumption of both countries. Now Belize, if you take, basically you're comparing D, which is before trade, because this over here is after trade, right? So you take the before trade, there's no trade here, and after trade. So if you take 22 minus 20, that's 2. 15.5 minus 15 is 0.5. 8 minus 5 is 3, and 12 minus 10 is 2. So this is the increase in wealth and consumption of both countries. Okay, so there you have it. That's the theory of why free trade is beneficial. The statistics that have been done on studies for whether free trade is beneficial have basically shown that it is. Now, some economists and some folks have pointed out, and they argue that it doesn't adequately compensate for the loss of income from job losses, etc. Most of the studies, from what I can determine, say that still it's beneficial even if you take that into account. I'm not going to say that the issue's not open to doubt, but I'm just telling you, trying to give you what both sides say. Now, let me just say this. What this does, this increase in wealth down here, what these statistics, even if it is beneficial, here is one potential drawback. This increase in wealth down here, it does, this example says nothing about how this new wealth is distributed. And you know, countries, nowadays countries don't trade, companies trade. And so you have a situation where you have corporations. Is all this increased wealth just going to the stockholders of these trading companies? Is society generally benefiting from this, or is just the corporate executives and the stockholders? What about the workers? Well, they're not going to get direct benefits of this unless they get unless the lowest paid worker gets a bonus too. So that's one question that's not taken into account. The other thing is that free trade now and then, nowadays, you're talking about a situation where there's questions of sovereignty and how much governmental rights you're going to give away. There's this organization, we're going to do another video on it, called the World Trade Organization, that enforces free trade agreements. But when you do that, you're basically giving an international body the right to come in and make decisions which the United States has to abide by. People don't like to give up governmental powers like that. That's another issue with free trade. Another one is countries competing on the basis, and this goes to the job issue of, is one country just using child labor and bad working conditions, whereas we have OSHA over here and better working conditions, plus overtime rules and all that kind of stuff. And I'm not arguing that all that stuff one way or the other. I'm just saying that the labor laws aren't the same. So they're not just, so people say, hey, we shouldn't be talking about free trade. We should be talking about fair trade, similar working conditions, if we're going to compete against these countries. And a lot of times, trade agreements get into issues of sovereignty. The parties agreed on what they're going to do about respecting each other's patent rights, intellectual property rights, and things of that nature. And oddly enough, agricultural goods really become a sticking point in some of these negotiations because some countries subsidize their farming community, and there's some questions. And if a government is subsidizing their farming community, and then you get into exporting and importing agricultural products, you've got governments buttressing their companies and their farmers against another country. In fact, China, for example, they, in addition to being accused of artificially suppressing the exchange value of their currency, the renminbi versus, it's also called yuan, versus the US dollar, they've also been accused of various other things to basically engage in protectionism and making it difficult for anybody to get into China to sell them goods and things like that by imposing quotas and barriers, which is not free trade if you do that. So let's see. And the other thing, a very important thing, because to keep in mind is that, of course, everybody wants some job security and everybody wants good jobs. We're going to have another video on exchange rates and what affects various exchange rates between countries. It's a very interesting discussion. It's vitally important because it affects interest rates, the national, the national debt and money supply and things of that nature. And also has to do with whether America is ever going to be able to export, get its export businesses going so that workers can get those good, high-paying factory jobs. Some question about whether that's ever going to be able to happen anyway, because in an age of increasing technology, it may be that workers are going to have to retrain more often during their lives than they have in the past. And nobody's going to have a whole lot of job security because of technology. I saw a sign driving down the road the other day about robotic surgery. Well, my feeling is that if the robots are taking over for the surgeons, nobody's job is totally safe. So technology is going to probably make job security more of an iffy thing in the future, regardless of the trade issues. So, in any event, they're all very interesting subjects, but I just wanted to raise those points. I don't think I have anything else. I think that's it. Anyway, well, I just want to thank everybody for visiting us at reasonandbalance.com. I hope that you found this to be a useful video. Thank you.
Boop boop bop ba dum bum. Boop boop bop ba dum ba da dum da dum da dum ba dum bum. Beep bop boop bop boop 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 da ba dum bum. Beep bop boop bop beep beep boop boop ba dum bum. Boop boop bop ba dum bum. Boop boop bop ba dum ba da dum da dum da dum ba dum bum. Beep bop boop bop boop 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 da ba dum bum. Beep bop boop bop beep beep boop boop ba dum bum. Boop boop bop ba dum bum. Boop boop bop ba dum ba da dum da dum ba dum bum. Beep bop boop bop boop 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 da ba dum bum. Beep bop boop bop beep beep boop boop ba dum bum.